My dear friends, today is the Friday before the Christian holiday of Easter, which our Christian neighbors refer to as Good Friday. Bishop James Pike once defined a Christian as a person who took the crucifixion of Jesus and resurrection personally. The bishop then went on to define a Jew as a person who took the story of the Exodus from Egypt personally. He's right, or as Rabbi Kushner writes in his Torah commentary, in a real sense, Passover is where Judaism begins. Passover is what turned we descendants of Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob, Rachel and Leah into a people, extending this eternal covenant between God and the Jewish people after liberation from slavery for all time. Passover's message of freedom, though, is not limited to only 7 days. The memory of the Exodus infuses every Shabbat whenever we recite the Kiddush, as we sang earlier with Happy, and on every Sabbath, Zecher L'Tziat Mitzrayim. Every version of the Kiddush, even on every other Jewish holiday, includes that line, to be mindful of our people's going forth from Egypt. Even if this week those words take on a more powerful resonance as we dedicate 7 days to the Exodus story and the overwhelming joy and gift of freedom, recalling the first of the 10 Commandments, Anochi Adonai Elohecha asher hotziticha me'eretz Mitzrayim. I, God, am the one who sets you free, wants you to be free. A Jewish message for all humanity, not just our own people. While there is a special Torah reading for this Sabbath during Passover, what's fascinating to me is how the all of our history and heritage, even the Torah itself, informs this week. In the Torah cycle, for instance, we're still in the book of Leviticus, even though we've begun the wilderness march in time from leaving Egypt to arriving at Mount Sinai when Moses and our people will receive the 10 Commandments, as we earlier recited, the Omer period we're in, when we get to the festival of Shavuot. But it will take 40 years of wandering. The name of the fourth book of the Torah, Bamidbar, we call Numbers, really means in the wilderness. And a major lesson we glean from Moses and this COVID year still not over is that life is a lot more like the wilderness, the Midbar, than we think. For all the drama of the Red Sea at our Seders last week, or receiving the Torah at Mount Sinai next month, life is not really filled with excitement on a non-stop, ongoing basis. Think about this. Our Jewish ancestors spent less than 1 year traveling to and then camping at Mount Sinai. They spent the better part of 39 years of 40 wandering through the wilderness. Most of us take a week or two of vacation each year, but most of our year is not spent celebrating a May graduation or November Thanksgiving. It's the wilderness. It's the normal work week where we live, not Sinai, even as we begin to escape the Egypt of COVID this Passover week. Passover is one of the 3 pilgrimage festivals when our ancestors would literally walk to Jerusalem, hence the Hebrew term shalosh regalim, which means, I'm not making this up, the 3 legs, as in your legs, 3 times a year, in the spring for Passover, pre-summer for Shavuot, and fall for Sukkot. Every Jew was to make a pilgrimage on foot to the temple in Jerusalem to thank God for the harvest of food, to pray for more, to pray for just the right amount of rain, not too much, as we've seen with the climate out of control, not too little, or humans die from drought and starvation. 3 times a year, these agriculturally based celebrations add historical linkages with spiritual messages blending past and present, nature and history. Think of it this way, Kushner comments. There are two ways of looking at time. We can see time as cyclical, the same thing happening over and over. Tuesday follows Monday, and Wednesday comes after Tuesday, week after week. Spring gives way to summer, which is followed by autumn and winter. That's seeing time cyclically. Or we can see time as directional, not going around in circles, but leading from somewhere to somewhere else. Every day is a brand new day, one that has never existed before. Today is not just Friday, it is a brand new Friday. This month is not just another step in the predictable cycle of the seasons, it is a blank new page in the calendar waiting to be filled in. The cyclical view of time is the domain of nature and the elements. The directional view is the world of history and our place in this moment in time, how we live and what we make of our lives. The genius of Judaism's 3 pilgrimage holidays or festivals is their success in combining both views of time, the worlds of nature and history, which is why this coming Thursday and the Thursday after are not simply when the hands of the time clock will trace their way around a circle to Thursday over and over again. This Thursday is Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, and the Thursday after is Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel Independence Day. From the near death of the Jewish people at the end of the Shoah in 1945 to the resurrection of the Jewish people in the land of Israel 3 years later in 1948. What have history and nature taught us these past 76 years since the Holocaust ended as Israel's 73rd birthday approaches? I would argue what we have learned from these two views of time is the sin of silence across space and time. Nature witnesses all these events, including the beautiful trees in Memphis and Shelby County. They witnessed, many of them still standing, where 27 black people were lynched in this city and county. But being God's human creations in history affords us the moral duty not only to watch it, not only to avoid evil, but to destroy that evil, to oppose it with the good and the right. As firsthand memories of the Holocaust fade with the deaths of survivors, or as this week's New York Times article depicting the personal experience of one of the 200,000 or so Auschwitz survivors among the 1.3 million sent there, 1.1 million were murdered. This artist survivor asks in her gripping painting of a Nazi guard running after a naked girl, she asks in this article, how can we understand what it's like to be a half-starved, naked Jewish girl running for her life from an Auschwitz rapist? She answers, we can't imagine it, even if her painting gives us a glimpse of what it means to be the most vulnerable person on earth. Dehumanization was as much the precondition for Auschwitz as it was its outcome, but it happened not because of Hitler, but because the German people back then dismissed their responsibility with the lame excuse, it's really none of my business. The Jewish read on time and history goes so far as to take a leap of faith that the God who created us believes, this God believes that injustice anywhere is everybody's business. The events of the past 76 years and Holocaust Memorial Day, which we observe again this Thursday, should have already taught us this lesson well. When the Nazis began their diabolical destruction, first of the Jews and eventually even Catholics and Protestants, whether gay, gypsy, or straight, the whole world kept silent. They did not approve of the Nazi massacre. People said quietly it was awful, but there were no marches on Washington to protest the liquidation of human lives in Germany. There were no massive demonstrations in front of the German embassy back then, no sit-ins, no boycotts, no protests. Not a few million lives were extinguished because the world was silent. Even now, in this country, and in Israel as well, we are still battling to regain that lost conscience. The struggle for liberty and human dignity, freedom from coercion, freedom from violence and terror, freedom over oppression is every person's cause, because so long as one of us is in danger, none of us can ever be secure. Not as a micro-tribe of white nationalists in America, or scary Jewish religious nationalists, racists in Israel, but as a society committed to God's goodness over human evil, which is what most of us in America and Israel want. Silence, though, is the sin. Silence over the far-right parties in Israel backing the current prime minister in his bid to form a new government. They're demanding, in return for joining this potential coalition of legislators, they're demanding to cancel Israel's commitment to combating violence against women and upholding international law with respect to the human rights of women and girls. The list of demands from this needed partner for them to form this government. The list of demands also includes ultra-Orthodox rabbis controlling who is defined as a Jew, and government initiatives that will shut down grocery stores on Saturdays, even though for most Israelis it's their only day off. And most American Jews don't even know what's going on, that this is going on right now in Israel, with alliances being made with the most unsavory and extremist Jewish elements to keep the current administration in power, with silence over the specter of a chauvinist, racist government that will send Israel back to the Middle Ages. The silence, not just in Israel, but in America today. The silence of the German people back then, not too long ago, in Nazi Germany, was what annihilated the Jews. And the German government and people, let's be honest, have done a better job since then outlawing domestic terror since the Shoah than America and even Israel have, because as Santanaya warned, all it takes for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. No one can be silent anymore. No one. To be a Jew is to grow up with some very painful memories of how the non-Jewish world has treated us, especially on this day when churches would unleash mobs to terrorize Jews on Good Friday. But to base one's Jewish identity solely on anti-Semitism or the silence of others is to create a need to find the thread of anti-Semitism even when it is not there. As we approach Yom HaShoah, we will not be silent. As we approach Israel Independence Day, we will not be silent. I cry when I think of the Holocaust, over all the Jewish lives that never happened, that were cut off. 1.5 million children, adult scientists and musicians, the families, just like mine, butchered by the Nazis because of the silence of the masses who let it happen. But my emphasis is to remember how those Jews lived rather than define them by how they were killed. Not for my emotional or psychological needs, but because it would be historically untrue back to time not to portray their Jewish lives and love for Judaism as a blessing and source of goodness in a world gone mad. Friends, Jews lived happily in Spain, creating rich poetry, philosophy, music, and more for hundreds of years before the church's inquisition and expulsion of Jews in 1492. We created great Jewish communities in Poland and Lithuania and Berlin and Czechoslovakia over a period of 1,000 years before those communities were destroyed by the Nazis. To see Jewish history across space and time solely in terms of bloodshed and persecution would be like describing the life of a good and dear friend as a bitter tragedy because toward the end of it, he got sick and died. That's a disservice to our people and to any person you know. Thank God the Jewish people hasn't died. Am Yisrael Chai. The Jewish people live from Shoham, Israel to T.I. Memphis, but silence is death. In the face of moral abominations, whether denying people the right to vote in this country or endorsing the suppression of religious rights for non-Orthodox Jews in Israel, we must not flinch. Politicians will manufacture all kinds of excuses for their failures to act, but a God of moral goodness will not. Religious maturity implies choices. That's what we tell all our bar and bat mitzvah students here at Temple. It means choosing what is right and speaking up instead of choosing what is beneficial to your own interests selfishly. It means choosing what is right instead of what is convenient, and the two are not always the same. It means living with your conscience and not with your excuses. The soul of our nation and the soul of our spiritual homeland Israel is at stake. On Monday, the president of the state of Israel will give his recommendation on whether this far-right extreme, including racist bloc, nationalists supporting Netanyahu will move into power, or whether a broad spectrum across conservative, centrist, and left parties will guide Israel's future. On Tuesday, our global reform movement is organizing a prayer session at the section of the Western Wall where men and women can gather peacefully instead of being spat on or attacked by Jewish religious nationalists. It will be a prayerful, peaceful protest against the racist elements joining the next Knesset during their swearing in next week. In closing, stay awake, friends, and for God's sake, do not remain silent or indifferent when Passover ends tomorrow night. Time in Judaism, both in nature and history, urges us to worry enough and care enough about the world we live in and to sacrifice a little comfort to salvage a little conscience, whether in this city, Memphis with a soul, or in the city of all souls, Jerusalem. Amen.